and instead of active citizens, started to speak about responsible citizens. Because he said, well, be active, but being active doesn't mean that you become a revolutionary. We want you to be active, but also to be really aware of the consequences of your actions. That's why this concept of responsible citizenship, the idea that the citizen is one that not only do what he or she think that is right to do, but also a person who is aware of the consequences of his action. The last element that I want to highlight is about whether Scouting is promoting social stability, social political stability, or social transformation. And this is related with a very relevant element that I explained before, which is this element that we empower individuals. And once they are empowered, they are not under our control anymore. So you have to see Scouting as a combination of a movement and an organization. So we see Scouting traditionally as an organization because aesthetically you see the name of the organization, you see the headquarters, you see the documents, you see the meetings with the minister, the meetings with the principal of the school, and all of this is the organization, the leaders, etc. So traditionally, Scouting as organization had been a tool of social-political stability in all the countries in the world. It had always had the protection of the state institutions. It had been close to the school. It had been close to the mayor of the city council. It had been close to social-political activity. But Scouting, precisely because it empowers individuals, precisely because we ask them, we empower them to be individuals with critical thinking. We give them basic values of coexistence, and we say, you take this and you build your model of society. And also because Scouting is organized by volunteers, people that join Scouting because they want, people that are not paid, people that cannot be fired. For all of this, Scouting as a movement could challenge social-political institutions or social-political stability when this social-political stability clashes with the inclusive values of Scouting. So that happened, for instance, in the process of decolonization, when people in the colonies that were in Scout associations were saying, well, if I'm the brother of every other Scout, why I am less as a citizen than the British citizen? Or that happened in South Africa or in the United States, when people said, if I am brother of every other Scout, why should I accept that in my society I am legally discriminated because I'm from a different race? Or that happened in countries, or for instance in gender discrimination, when in countries where there is a clear legal discrimination to women. Think, for instance, that in most countries of the world, the women had votes during the first half of the 20th century. So in many countries, women were participating in Scouting, in Girl Scouting or in Girl Guiding, and they said, well, why I am the ruler of my association and I cannot be the ruler of my country? So, or even now in the United States, Scouting is a rule of social struggle against discrimination to homosexuals. And this is a big issue in the last decade in the United States. So Scouting is, as a movement, as the addition of each one of the individuals that voluntarily compose Scouting, is a tool of social transformation. And it's important to understand this double logic, Scouting as an organization and Scouting as a movement, because in this tension is where you see the social outcome of Scouting. If Scouting as an organization clashes with the values that Scouting expresses, these inclusive values of coexistence, there is a direct reaction of Scouting as a movement saying, you are being inconsistent with the values of Scouting. So once you establish these very intuitive, harmless values of coexistence, these values cannot be changed anymore. You cannot say, oh, let me rephrase this. Scout is brother to every other Scout except of Japanese Scouts. You cannot add this anymore. It was like, why is that? I mean, let me understand this. So you create a different kind of ethos for the individuals, and this ethos is what made them disempowered individuals that become active citizens. I might speak a little bit later, if you wish, about something that we discussed before, the idea of moral and civic education, but this could be on the questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay, I think everybody has learned quite a lot, especially about the tension root. They can go far back to the Denmark about the ideological tension. And I think now we can have some Q&A time. So we open the floor to everybody. If you have some questions to ask about Scouting or about the topic Vallory today talk about. Okay, now, did anybody have some question?
Okay, if there are no questions, let me then answer the conversation that we had before. I'm going to answer a question that it was not here but was before. The idea of moral education, civic education, and life skills. So what I've learned is that here in Taiwan, there is a difference on what is properly civic education and what is moral education. So moral education being closer on what is taught in school of what Scouting education is, and civic education being another more institutionalized thing. Am I saying right, or am I being confused?
Yes.
More or less. Well, let me go to this. The question is that when we talk about character education, we are talking about elements, we are talking about different elements. One element in character education is the moral reference. So the moral reference is what is good, what is the idea of good. And the consequence of this idea of good is what is good behavior. So we have a moral idea of what is good and what is bad. And then we ask people to have a behavior as a consequence of this. For instance, killing is bad. So you do not kill. But also that could be related with other things. Respect to elders, behavior in the street, duties to your family. So the moral education could be something quite wide. In Scouting, moral education is very focused on these basic inclusive values of coexistence. So our basic moral education are these harmless values that are saying being a good person means being able to live in community in a way that all members of community could have similar conditions to fulfill their life project. And this seems super basic, but this is revolutionary when you think in a society that has a big rich-poor gap, or in a society that has some kind of racial discrimination or nationality discrimination, or you have differences of access to health. So these basic values are our moral reference. And those basic values, if you talk about these values, it's very difficult to find any society in the world that says that these values are bad. Because in most cases, discrimination tries to be founded in moral grounds. For instance, in the time of slavery, there were many people trying to write to prove that Africans had no soul. They said, oh, of course they are slaves because they have no soul. If they have no soul, they are not really humans as we are. So we agree that all humans are equal. What we say is that they look like humans. They are not humans. So something similar happened, for instance, with the immigration of Chinese people in California in the 19th century. So Americans said in the Constitution, all citizens are created equal. But they made lots of laws in California to avoid Chinese people to own houses, to have the right to vote, to be able to evolve socioeconomically. So it has always been a tension between the moral discourse and the practice. But the interesting thing is that if you have a good base on the moral discourse, one day or another, this moral discourse is gonna explode in front of the inequality, as it happened in the United States with racial discrimination, for instance, or as it happened in most countries of the world, not all of them, with legal women's discrimination. At least we have in most countries of the world legal similar status to women, although not real similar status to women. But there is no moral ground. Now it's very difficult to find someone saying, between you and I, if the Director General is a woman, I have the right not to obey what the Director General says. Because we know that now, morally speaking, this is wrong. So, moral education in Scouting is these basic elements of coexistence. Now, you cannot have civic education without these basic moral references. And in one of the things that I didn't talk about, which is the reference of Bernard Crick, who is a British social scientist who helped the British government to work on the idea of citizenship education. He said, citizenship education in a democracy should be based on inclusive values, very basic ones. Because if you start to enter into elements that could be controversial, you are not doing citizenship education, you are indoctrinating, you are saying what is good and what is bad. That's what this basic moral education should be the fundament of what civic education is. The behavior in society is the consequence of the basic elements that should fundament how an individual should behave in community. So the two things are linked. But now let me go to the third element that is also related with character education. I was saying before that there is a recent book that I recommend a lot that is called How Children Succeed. I would write it here, but I don't want to paint it on this. How Children Succeed. How Children Succeed is a book by an American journalist called Paul Todd. And he explains the latest findings in research in economics, in neuroscience, in psychology, and also in some medical approaches. Okay, thank you. This is... So, this is an H. So, How Children Succeed is a book, it's a divulgation book, it's not a scientific book. And it's a book that put together big findings in research in the last decade, showing that most societies had been analyzing success in education based fundamentally in cognitive skills, what economists call cognitive skills. You could identify what cognitive skills are if you think in something that is familiar to you, which is the PISA report. So, the thing is that formal education had been very similar in the last century. We have schools where kids sit for 50 minutes and someone goes there and gives them information and fills the head of the kids with information, and they go to another thing, they sit, they fill the information. After this we do tests to see if they had the information well introduced to the brains, and we send them to the university. But when you go to the professional life, you realize that there are many things that are relevant that you don't get from school. For instance, the capacity of adaptation, creativity, self-confidence, resilience, which is the capacity to overcome failure, commitment or persistence to have a goal and to go for it, the capacity to work with others. All these elements are not taught in school. I'm generalizing, you know what I mean. So those are not the main elements. And when we go to the most recent tool, or the first world tool to analyze at world level how comparatively formal education is performing in all the countries in the world, the only thing that this is analyzing are cognitive skills. How good they are in maths, how good they are in reading comprehension, how good they are in science. And this is very important. But this is just part of the story. This is not explaining how they are going to be successful in entering in college. Because you could have good grades, but then having an anxiety crisis before entering college and blocking yourself. Or you could be at college and then after the first year thinking that you cannot put that much effort and leaving it. Or you could finish college and go to your company, and then your company asking you to do something radically different that you learned in the university, and you say, oh, I'm sorry, this is not what I've learned. So the interesting thing that Toff explained is that economists, led basically by the most important name in all this constellation, that is Heckman, James Heckman. He's a Nobel laureate in economics. He's professor at the University of Chicago. And Heckman had been working in the last 15 years on non-cognitive skills. He says, well, when we economists want to predict success and we take cognitive skills, we cannot predict them. Some people are very good on grades, and then they have a failure life, failure in family, failure in the university, failure in the professional world. And then you have people that is totally the opposite. They go to the school, they maybe have bad grades and stuff, and then they are super successful in life. They are super successful in family. How is that? And then you have this Steve Jobs thing saying, oh, maybe university is not important. Well, it's not that easy. It's not that non-cognitive skills are the only important. But what Heckman and many other findings in neuroscience and in psychology explain, what they found is that non-cognitive skills, which is what psychology have called personality traits, and what people in the street call character, are fundamental basis to build cognitive skills. You cannot build cognitive skills properly if you have not developed these non-cognitive skills. The question, though, is that in societies with social inequality, people from middle and upper middle class families have acquired these non-cognitive skills through socialization. Because your parents told you how to behave. And you know that, I know that if I'm seated here and the chairman comes and throws the computer to me, I'm not going to punch him. I'm going to say, you are quite unpolite, and I'm going to leave. But if you have been grown up in an environment where violence is a reaction, you might have a behavior that is going to destroy your possibilities to evolve in life. So, socioeconomical difference could explain the difference on the acquirement of these non-cognitive skills. Now, the good news that those researchers are explaining is that non-cognitive skills are similar as, let's say, sport skills. I mean, when you play some kind of sport, you know that some people is very good at it, and some people is very bad at it. Some people take a ball and could play with the ball very well, and some others don't know how to do it. Someone could run very fast, and some others don't. But we know that you could practice and get better. This is the same with non-cognitive skills. There are things that could be just the way that you are, but some others could be acquired. And this is a big change on the approach of character education. Because traditionally, from the conservative approach, it had been said, character is important. But that meant wealthy people have this character of knowing how to behave, etc., because this is the consequence of their family. And you know, poor people are poor because they are bad behavior people. What we have learned now is that those non-cognitive skills is not the consequence of who your father is, but how you socialize with your father, with your friends, with your brothers and sisters, in your school, in your scout activities. So the interesting thing is that these three levels, moral education, civic education, and character development, are totally linked. Because these basic elements of the basic values of coexistence that fundament the civic behavior and that are related with these character traits that make people able not only to be good at the PISA report, but also to build fulfilling lives, lives that are worth to be lived, are elements that you could find in Scout education together. I don't know if I answered the questions than before.
Okay, that was the question I posed for Vallory before his speech, but I think we will have more response from the floor. people here. Is anybody? Okay.
I just got a question. You just mentioned about the Scouting needs to care about the international issues and have others. But as we know, many associations have done that before. And just like what you say, for example, in Barcelona, people help with many people help with painting and electricity repairing. But what's the difference between Scouting and the association?
Between Scouting and?
The association, the charity association. I mean, how do you define and distinct from them?
Well, yeah, the main difference, and this is fundamental, is that in Scouting, all activities, all of them are educational means. So you do all the activities because you want a particular outcome. And this is very fundamental because traditionally the problem with the Scouting is that it's so powerfully intuitive that when you try to identify the things, you go and identify the things that you see. You identify the statics and you identify the activities. And then some associations start saying, well, I don't really know how to explain what I do, so what I'm going to do is to write this. And they start to write activities. Activity number 1, you go to the mountain and you plant a tent. Activity number 2, you show kids how to do Morse things. Activity number 3, you build, you know how to make fire. Activity number 4, you paint. But this is not relevant because what you want is people able, for instance, to know that they could do better than they do. So you want to work the effort. To develop effort, you could do it in many different ways. So the relevant thing is that you know that you are developing effort. If you want to develop the capacity of doing things good, on being perfectionist, on being artisan, you could do it in many different ways. You don't want people that say, whatever, I could do it that way because who cares? No, we want you to care. But that could be done in many ways. You could do an origami, or you could build a big installation. The relevant thing is not the origami or the big installation. The thing is that the kid realizes through the experience that what he or she is doing is something that makes a difference if he do it good or he do it bad. You could do it painting. You could do it in many things. So what's the difference in this case? What's the difference with the charity association? That the goal of the charity association is to paint this. This is the Architects Without Frontiers goal. They want to help these people to have better houses. But Scouting uses this activity to create the awareness of the social reality of these kids. Because there is a big difference in the theoretical learning and the practical learning. The learning by doing means that you learn through your experience. If I sit here and I tell you there is many people in the world that is having military conflict and this is problematic, you would say, yeah, I've learned about this, yeah, I read it in the newspaper. But if all of us go together to a place where people is demonstrating in the streets and someone is shooting from the top of the buildings and the person that is close to you is killed, your feeling of what a conflict is changed totally, and that changed your life. And what we want in Scouting through the experiential learning is that this experiential learning change their lives, because otherwise you cannot have this character development. We want them to experience that, for them to say, okay, no one told me what inequality is. I experience what inequality is because I know this person that has a particular name. and that lives in a particular place. And I've spent 3 weekends in my life in his house, and I know the difference that I made in his life. And I know that this is not enough. And this is something that is much more than the charity association wants. The charity association wants to change these particular things. What we want is to change the causes of this particular thing. Sure.
Dr. Vallory, I want to just comment your example because your example is too radical. We will not definitely bring our scouts to see the demonstration on site and see people to be killed. I think in reality, I think what you mentioned is about the design of the program. What do we want to do? And so, and scouting is also to provide a safe environment for the young people to have some to experience something. So I think your example is too radical.
Remember that I didn't say if we take the scouts.
Oh, okay. If.
I said if I take you. So what I meant is that the experience is what counts. Obviously, I don't recommend anyone to take scouts in any environment that could be harmful.
Okay. Anybody?
Okay, I'm glad that you talk about relationship between moral education, civic education, character education, because to us it's quite, say, perplexing. So may I request that you put down your answers and send us through email. So give us a bibliography so we can study more. But I still think usually scouting in the past was described a means of character education. And Baden Powell also said that activities are all means. The character is the end. Now I want you to describe what character are they? Is there any, say, because character has to do with characteristics, right? So what kind of character? Just like what kind of life, what kind of society, what kind of character? Thank you.
Well, there is a very nice drawing of Baden Powell in Scouting for Boys. Yeah, I think that's a Scouting for Boys that that goes over the slogan: "The Scout is active, being good." Sorry, the Scout is active, doing good, and not passive, being good.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you've seen it. Basically, what you have is a kid dressed as a scout, done like this, in a very superior way. This is the one that is passive, being good.
Okay.
And then you have a kid that is running and smiling, and this is the one that is active, doing good. I think that in character, when you take the initial texts of Baden Powell, you cannot forget that he is a son of the Victorian and Edwardian society in Britain, where many references of character are related with manliness, the idea that you have to be masculine, or many of these things. And I think that you could perfectly filter these contextual elements that are historical and go back to the current findings of what character means. So in the Baden Powell writings, you could identify many of the things that today these people in economics, in psychology, or in neurosciences are saying that are relevant for children to succeed when we talk about education. And this character, for instance, when Baden Powell says that the scout should have listen the other fellow's point of view before having his own opinion, means that the person should be autonomous. So an autonomous person is a person who has capacity to understand the things and have its own mind. And when Vallory says that the scout can be trusted, and this is something in the scout law, he's saying that the scout is responsible. So he's a person that could have responsibility for his life. And to have responsibility means many things. Means have self-confidence. Means to have self-control. Means to have persistence, capacity to develop yourself. Means to have also leadership capacity. So there are many elements that you could take from the definition of character that are basically summarized on this idea that the scout should be able to paddle his own canoe, which means that the scout should be able to lead his own life.
Yes, self-reliant.
So, exactly, we want individuals that are not dependent on what the others say, or that are not lost in life, that could build their capacities. And part of building your own life means being able to be good in maths, to be good in reading, to have capacity to develop abstract cognitive skills, to understand what science says. But those things are only possible if you first develop this structure, these non-cognitive structures in your mind that makes you not only successful in the tests, but also successful in the big test of life, which is the one that makes you arrive in your late years and see if your life had been worth living. If the time that you devoted to your family, the time that you devoted to study, the time that you devoted to your work, were times well spent. And this is something that you can only have if you develop this moral inner you, and also if you develop the skills that make this moral inner you be transformed in your real you.
Okay, thank you. I will pedal
Your canoe.
Okay, anybody?
Thank you for giving us such a good lectures, and made me know more about scouting. But I'm still curious about how scouting encourage the Boy Scouts to guide themselves and even challenge the authority in a disciplined environment.
Yes.
Okay, the first part, which is the idea of paddling your own canoe, so living your own life. The way Scouting do that is precisely because it creates, it's because it's a consequence of the educational method of Scouting. So the combination of the different elements of the method, the learning by doing, the work in small teams, the interaction between adults and young people in a constructive way, not in a hierarchical way, the values of the promise and the law, that basically means that the scout is the protagonist of his own development, of his own education. The combination of the elements of the scout method are the ones that make the scout aware that he is able to change his personality and he is able to build his new self. So I'm sure that probably many of you know cases of kids that go to Scouting being very timid or with like big complexes. Maybe one is overweight, or some other is not very beautiful, or some other is not tall, and they go there and they have these problems of self-esteem or problems of self-capacity, and in Scouting, you create an environment which each individual is relevant. And each one of them could fulfill their dreams. And because these basic values of coexistence, no one could live in a Scout environment being consequent and being discriminator. So something that I didn't mention you, but I put here at the beginning of the point 5 another quote, which is a study that you could find on the internet called The Educational Impact of Scouting, shows that Scouts filter the coherence between the Scout values and what they see from the Scout leaders, from the Scout organization, or from the Scout environment. So they are able to perceive the inclusive power of these values and then see if the leader is being inconsistent. So if the leader say, "You fat boy," they say, "Oh, this is not nice. And this is not what we Scouts do." So they don't imagine that what Scouts do is what the leaders say. They could start challenging the very vision of Scouting that the leader has. But this is because in the Scout method, we empower them. We don't empower them because we go and we say, "Now you are empowered." It's because the activities that they do empower them. The activities that they do make them being aware that they could be able to solve things. When they do the origami, or when they do the big installation, when they do a particular game, when they paint, when they do all these things, they realize that they are better than they imagine. They have more capacities than they imagine. And also, when they have this strong and very basic values of coexistence, and they could be able to challenge even the vision of his Scout leader, is when they could also develop the capacity to challenge any social environment that is clashing with these values of coexistence, because they develop this through experience. They know that they have values that are so basic that when someone tries to violate them, it's quite evident that you have no ideological approach that could fundament this violation. And it's when they have the legitimacy to say, "This is not my values. Those are not my values. I could overcome them. I could fight for them to be changed."
Okay, I will make a promotions for this afternoon class. OK， 各位，那个今天的演讲呢，非常的，各位应该有很多收获。不过下午呢，我的课在2点钟，在研究室1，还有这个做这个书斋啊，这个书的书斋跟他的研究经历，研究他的做研究的这个心得的回顾，也是大概有1小时50分钟。I promote my class this afternoon. Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can ask one question.
Of course.
You're talking about coexistence, which is the central idea of the Scouting. And it seems to me it's quite similar to the idea of the right. You talk about the human rights of Scouting.
Yes. Let me precisely on this. Yes. If you go to page 3, because it's also reference on this, in the 3rd paragraph, I explain also that there is a very relevant element of this. So, what I call these basic values of coexistence, which are the ones that you see in the Scout Law, we are talking about values that were established between 1908 and 1920. Because a very important thing that people don't know is that Baden-Powell changed every single edition of Scouting for Boys every year. So it was a clear evolution also on the writing. So when now you read something of Scouting for Boys, you probably read the 20th or the 30th edition of Scouting for Boys modified, not the 1908, that if you read it, there are some things that are a little bit shocking. But these basic values of coexistence, many years later, were also the values that were founding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So here what it says that World Scouting as a world movement and also as a world organization in 1945 and later became, like in the 20s with the League of Nations, very committed with the idea of the United Nations. And it was one of the first institutions that become a member of the council, the social council that advises from the NGOs in the world, the United Nations. It participated with UNICEF, with UNESCO, etc. But it has been, since the very beginning, explicitly committed with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also with the UN Conventions of the Rights of the Child. And this is very relevant because these basic values of coexistence with the years could start to have some people saying, oh well, you know, in Taiwan, for us, these basic values of coexistence means accepting that we discriminate Catalans. It's something traditional. I mean, some Catalans came here, they behave very bad because they eat a lot of garlic and they make them very violent, so we discriminate Catalans. So somehow the World Organization established this reference to the Human Rights Declaration and also to the Declaration of the Rights of the Child to say, well, we don't want to impose a particular vision of society, but we want to have a clear reference of what is the basics of our values. And the basics are this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it cannot be any Scout organization in the world that do any practice that is clashing with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the UN Declaration of Rights of the Child. And I think that this is very good because going back to the idea of global citizenship, we start building some kind of moral fundamentals for the civic reference of what a world citizen is, which is a person that not only has these basic values of coexistence, but also as a citizen has a basic reference on how society should be ruled at a global level.